Yat bene. Good morning, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and I wanted to talk about the past week of our globe, where we have watched two of probably the most colonial nations in world history mourn. With the passing of Queen Elizabeth, we've seen uh, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, mourn the death of their monarch. And this weekend, we commemorated the 21st anniversary of 9/11, and our nation has mourned the 3,000 deaths that took place at that terrorist attack on our country. And I want to talk about kind of the confusion that is evident when colonial nations mourn. But before I go there, let me start by acknowledging I'm speaking to you from what's now Washington, D.C., and that these are the lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of these lands. I want to thank them for their stewardship of the land. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So let me see who's on with me so far this morning. Hey, Mr. Phil Fox, thank you for joining me. R. Sullivan, Bina, thank you for joining. It's good to have you here. I hope both of you have a good cup of coffee that you can join me with as we sit down for a few minutes. But there's two mourning things that have gone on in the past week. And I want to start with the morning of 9/11, right? Most Americans remember where they were the moment we first heard about 9/11. I remember I was actually driving to work. I was working in Gallup, New Mexico, and I was on my way to work. And I had the radio on, and I was at a red light, and I heard a news bulletin about, I think, one of the first towers that had been hit. And I went into the office, and some people were gathered around television, and we sat there and watched for maybe an hour. I forget how long exactly, as these terrorist attacks kind of unfolded. And I think sometime after the second tower was hit, I just recognized I wasn't getting any work done that day. And so I went home. And I was a member of a church there, and I met with the pastor of our church, and we planned and got together a gathering for our church that evening of just bringing people together so that we could have some space to safely process what was going on and what had happened to our country that day. I think it was the next day, as I saw very quickly how the anti-Muslim sentiment took root, that my pastor and I encouraged him, and he came with me, and we went down to one of the mosques in the city just to introduce ourselves and to let them know we did not share the anti-Muslim sentiment that was sweeping very quickly across the country. And those are some of my very initial thoughts. I remember 9/11. I'll never forget that day. I'll never forget driving into the office and thinking about that, and just the feeling of vulnerability and the confusion and what's going on. And this literally was terror. There was a fear. We didn't know where the next attack was going to come. We didn't know what was happening. Things were very out of control. And since then, our nation has built massive monuments, some here in DC, some in New York City, other places around the country. And we've very much memorialized this, mourned this publicly, this attack on our nation. And after the attack, there was an immediate outpouring of sentiment and sympathy and concern for America. And our allies very quickly stood up and stood with us, and people all around the globe stood with America that day. And it was very kind of moving to see the words being spoken around the globe about concern for America and for Americans that day. However, again, there's several things, mixed emotions that have come into me since that day. First is how immediately this brought out this very unified but very strong sense of patriotism. If you remember the whole debacle with freedom fries and all of the things that, right, we're not going to we were mad at the French. I forget exactly why, but we were no longer going to call them French fries. They were not going to be freedom fries. And of course, you can't attack America and not pay massive consequences. And so very quickly, we begin moving into this global war on terror. And it literally went into the longest war in our nation's history, with the war in Afghanistan, which went on for 21 years. And I think this is where the mourning and the emotions become confused. Because yes, our nation was attacked, and yes, hundreds of innocent lives, thousands of innocent lives were lost in a moment in a brutal and needless attack of terrorism on our country. And it was horrific. It was scary. It was unjust. Right? There's so many things that went on that day. But we use that as a rallying cry for literally a global war on terror that we fought for 21 years. And that war has had unimaginable consequences, right? Brown University did a study on the war on terror, and they commissioned it, I think, back in 2010, and they completed it, I think, in 2021. And if you look at their study, and I'm going to just share this on my screen here, this is an article coming out of that study. The cost of that 20-year war on terror has been $8 trillion, and 900,000 people have died in that war on terror, including over 350,000 civilians. Think about that. There's another page for the study. I'm going to share this in the comment section now, where it's their whole project is called The Costs of War. And in their summary, again, over 929,000 people, civilians have died, or people have died. 387,000 civilians have been killed. 38 million refugees and displaced persons. And the cost to the US government alone has been $8 trillion. And we are conducting counterterrorism activities in 85 different countries. These wars have been accompanied by violations of human rights and civil liberties, both in the US and abroad. Right? And so this is where it becomes very confusing for how do we continue to mourn 9/11? Yes, I absolutely mourn with everyone who lost life or health or were terrorized by what happened on 9/11. But what we've done, what we've initiated, what we've led globally since then has been unbelievably horrific. And it's made it, to be honest, harder every year for me to know how to mourn and how to even publicly memorialize and commemorate 9/11 because of the horrible things that we've done. As I was on my book tour this past month, and I was talking at different points about war and about the fact I talked about the political agreement the Obama administration was negotiating with Iran, and how ironic it was that the only nation to ever use nuclear weapons on civilians is now trying to control who has access to nuclear power and to nuclear weapons. It's very ironic, right? And one of the things I pointed out is both Donald Trump and Joe Biden, when they felt afraid, when our nation felt afraid, threatened their big red button. That's Donald Trump's word. Joe Biden didn't use quite that language. But they both threatened huge, massive retaliations for wars and for terrorist attacks. After the one of the final terrorist attacks in Afghanistan, where the U.S. The airport was attacked, and several U.S. service members lost their lives. Right, Joe Biden literally threatened anyone who dare stand against America. And again, both of their threats, Trump and Biden, included threats of whatever measures are at my command, or Donald Trump, his big red button, right, which is a nuclear threat. And they say that this comes from both parties because this is what the American people expect. When we feel terrorized, when we feel afraid, when we feel threatened, we want to know we have a president who's in command, who is not going to hesitate to use every weapon in our arsenal. You know, we often use the language, we're not going to forgive you, we're not going to forget. We talk about 9/11, we're never going to forget this. And yet, one of the biggest challenges that I and many other Native and other people of color have is trying to get our nation to remember what we've done. And we just say, oh, that's in the past. We're going to forget that. We don't want to worry about that. We're not going to, right? And so the injustices that we commit against people, we're like, no, we can forget those. Just forgive us and move on. But when injustice is acted against us, we're like, we're never going to forgive this. We're never going to forget this. We're going to use every weapon at our command to make sure that you are punished for what you did to us. And right, this is where I've often said, when I looked at even Joe Biden, who said he's never going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. And his reasoning for that is, if he puts American boots, American soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, there is a very good chance that Putin would escalate their armed threat to nuclear. And of course, if Putin goes nuclear, the U.S. would have to go nuclear, because again, that's what we expect. And I pointed out the thinking behind this, and I'm grateful that Joe Biden recognizes he doesn't have the courage to not go nuclear, even at the threat of nuclear attacks by other nations. I'm grateful he recognizes his own lack of courage to not do that. But the reason he said we're not going to put boots on the ground, because again, the sentiment in the United States is it is better to destroy the globe than for America to lose a war. That's what I think most Americans believe. It's better to destroy the globe than for America to lose a war. And if you don't believe me, right, let's just go back to the findings from Brown University, where literally after 3,000 deaths and a single attack, or 3 attacks, right, 929,000 people died, 387,000 civilians, 38 million people displaced, $8 trillion, and we're conducting counterterrorism activities in 85 different countries. And the irony of this, right, is we are doing this over the loss of life, smaller than the loss of life that we experienced at different peaks in the COVID virus, the pandemic. Right? There were 2 times in the past 2.5 years. November, December, January, and February of 2020 and 2021, and January through March of 2022, where the average number of daily deaths were over 3,000 a day. More than died on 9/11 were dying daily from COVID. And yet, half of the Americans were protesting efforts to reduce those deaths through things like wearing masks and social distancing and doing things to protect not just individual health, but the health of the entire community. Right? This is where the irony comes up, right? Which is we do these things. This is what makes the mourning of colonial nations so befuddling. What are we really mourning? Are we mourning the loss of life? Are we mourning a lack of control and an inability to make our own decisions? Is that what we're mourning? I would argue we're not actually mourning death. Again, we were protesting just a few months ago when more people than died on 9/11 were dying daily, and we were protesting as a nation for our right to do things to further harm our health. So I don't think we're mourning life. We're not mourning the loss of life. We're not even mourning the loss of American lives. I think we're mourning limits on our colonialism, limits on our power. We're mourning attacks on us that we can't control. And this actually becomes even more clear when we look at the other nation, colonial nation that's mourning right now, which is the UK, who's mourning the death of their longest reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth, who was on the throne for 70 years, I think. And it's literally this 2-week long mourning period that, at least in the US, and I know in other parts of the traditional United Kingdom, the media is obsessed with it. I can't turn it off. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of hearing about people lining up to mourn Queen Elizabeth's death. I'm tired of it. And the thing that intrigues me the most is we're mourning the death of a monarch from a royal family that we literally committed insurrection against to get out from under their rule. Right? This is what the Declaration of Independence was all about. The king was trying to limit the right of discovery for the colonies, was trying to control and limit the colonial experience here in what they called the New World. And the colonies, and again, we weren't just like the Civil War was not about the value and the humanity of Black people. The Revolutionary War was not about throwing off colonial values. It was about the nation wanted the right to hold those colonial values for itself, which is why the Declaration of Independence bemoans the fact that the king is limiting their access to new appropriations of land and dehumanizing natives as merciless Indian savages. Right? The king was claiming the right of discovery solely for the crown, and the colonies were saying, oh, not so fast. We want that right of discovery for ourselves. So there was no real conflict of values in the Revolutionary War. It's we didn't want a monarch in another country limiting the colonialism of the colonies here in the United States, or here on Turtle Island. They wanted the right to ethnically cleanse and commit genocide of these lands themselves. which is why they fought the Revolutionary War. Again, it's fascinating that this nation, and this not only a nation, but a family, a monarchy that we literally committed insurrection against, we are now publicly mourning the death of one of the queens in that monarchy. This is the confusion of when colonial nations mourn, right? What are they mourning? What are we mourning? There's an article, I'll share it with you. It was on PBS NewsHour. I'm going to put it into, and this is, if you watch the posts, especially on social media, right? Not only are there a lot of interesting posts by Native peoples, but there's also fascinating posts and comments coming out of other colonized spaces like the continent of Africa. And this one in PBS News said, "I cannot mourn. Former colonies conflicted over Queen Elizabeth II's death." And right, so the monarchy is no longer in control of the UK, right? They're merely figureheads now. It's a constitutional monarchy, and so Parliament has the power to make and pass laws. The Queen, King, princes are all there for the sake of tradition and pomp and circumstance, and they're figureheads. They have no power. And I think it's a way for colonial nations to commemorate and hold up these shrines, human shrines, to their colonial histories. Right? Where do you think the wealth of Queen Elizabeth came from? Bake sales? Or from the lands they plundered and colonized and ethnically cleansed and enslaved and claimed discovery over? This is what's so fascinating about watching colonial nations mourn. I want to introduce you to somebody. Her name is Siouxsan Robinson. She's a Native woman from Canada, and she is married to a good friend of mine, Charles Robinson. Together, actually, she's now running their ministry called the Res Road, and or the Red Road, I think. Sorry, and doing some tremendous work. And she's from Canada, and I've been watching her posts over the past week, and she's been a little punchy in regards to the death of the Queen. And she shared a post, and I has gotten some pushback about that on her post. I'm going to share her post with you. She shared it publicly, so I'm going to share it with you. And I'm going to read it for you. I want you just to listen to what she said here, because she actually, again, I said she was been a bit punchy and a little irreverent in some people's eyes. And I think people have pushed back against her for that, and she's responded to some of that criticism. But she gave a post the other day where she explained where she's coming from, and I want to just read her comments to you. She said, "Growing up in Canada, I was exposed to an entirely different culture than the one I live in now. The monarchy was familiar to me as a child. I adored them, especially Princess Diana, Prince William, and Prince Harry. I grew up with them, and after their mama's tragic death, I felt a sense of protection over her boys. Although I didn't understand the colonization process at the time, I knew I didn't respect King Charles for how he treated his wife. He has since grown to be a much better man. As for Queen Elizabeth, I admired her for how she took over the throne at such a young age and for how she presented herself. As a Native woman, I understand the difficulties she must have faced during that time because women's voices were not respected at all. Anyway, once I began to understand what happened to my people, I began to question why she was allowing the assimilation process to continue. Then I found out that she had no voice at all, no power to make any types of change. She was literally just a leader in name only because Great Britain became a constitutional monarchy in 1689, which means that Parliament had the power to pass legislation and make decisions. Thanks to my mama, I've been walking this decolonization process for the past 30 years. The trauma is so embedded that it makes my heart ache because I know how many hours I've dedicated to my own mental wellness. Most of our people have yet to address any of their embedded trauma, so many of us are dying quickly. I have no ill feelings towards Queen Elizabeth because even if she could have helped us, she didn't have the power to do so. That power is in Canada's hands, and they have used her as the face of our demise while they continue to sabotage us behind the scenes. Hopefully, King Charles will do a better job in honoring the First Nations people and our treaties that we made with the Crown. And I think I really appreciated the perspective that Siouxsan brought to this whole experience. In fact, I was so impressed when I read that post last night. I messaged her and I asked if she would be willing to join me for a second cup of coffee sometime this week. And I'm going to talk with her later this morning and hopefully be able to work out a time either late this week or early next week where she can join me for a second cup of coffee and we can talk about her perspective on this, as well as the incredible work that she's doing with our Native peoples all across Turtle Island. I'm excited to hopefully have the opportunity to introduce you to her and to the work that her and her husband are doing. But anyway, I wanted to just offer some of this perspective because it's very discombobulating. It's very confusing. There's a lot of confusion that surrounds the process of colonial nations mourning because it's difficult to know what exactly they're mourning. And yeah, I think what I'm beginning to understand is that these nations aren't mourning death, right? Their whole existence, the existence of colonial nations, is based on the exploitation and the dehumanizing and the plundering and killing of people, right? That's the whole experience of that's how the nation exists. The nations don't necessarily have value for life. That's not what they're mourning per se. They're mourning limits on their colonialism. They're mourning threats against their powers. They're mourning, at least that's what their mourning turns into, right? I have no doubt that after 9/11, immediately there was this great outpouring over the immediate loss of life that had happened. But what we did with that mourning is we turned it into a global war on terror that has had consequences and repercussions far greater than we've ever imagined. And since then, we've actually protested for our right to have more people to die per day than were killed in 9/11 because we didn't want to limit our own freedoms by being told to wear masks or to social distance or to even get a vaccine. And so it's challenging to know what colonial nations actually mourn. And I'm not talking even necessarily individually, but corporately. And I wanted to just take some time to process through some of that with you this morning. I'm not trying to belittle the experience that I'm sure Prince Andrew and Prince Harry and King Charles and others are feeling at the loss of their mother and their grandmother. I do question why this nation is mourning the death of a person who symbolized their nation's history of colonialism. And I even question why then the globe is commemorating this person who symbolized colonialism to so many millions of people around the globe. Right? This is where the confusion begins to set in. So I hope this at least gives you some things to think about, some food for thought, maybe adjust your perspective a little bit on what's been going on. Let me look through some of the comments and see where people are at here. Miles Flegg said, you would do your audience well to have University of Victoria, BC, John Burroughs, an Indigenous legal expert on your show. Thanks for that suggestion, Miles. I appreciate that. I will try to research who he is. We have other messages. Someone else replied, Tam said, I understand her explanation as well. Thank you for that comment, Tam. I want to thank everyone for kind of sharing some thoughts and giving some input on this. I'll look through these comments a little bit later. I want to also announce a few other things that I have going on. I started putting this out on my social media yesterday, but next week, Thursday, I'm going to be in Charlottesville, Virginia at Mount Zion First African Baptist Church. And I'm going to be speaking there as part of my Unselling Truths book tour. And I'll be doing an event there that evening. So if you're in Charlottesville, or if you would like to learn more about that, let me also show you the flyer I created for that. So we'll be doing that at September 22nd, which is next Thursday at 6:30 p.m. And that's at 150 Lankford Avenue in Charlottesville. And I'll be giving my Unselling Truths book tour presentation titled Warning, Unselling Truths Will Challenge Your Paradigm. So if you're in Charlottesville, or if you know anyone in Charlottesville, please feel free to share that information with them. I'd love to get a very good group of people out and initiate this discussion and bring it along even further. I also want to continue to just let you know about the ongoing work I'm doing. So you can still obviously purchase copies of my book, Unsettling Truths, and we're selling those copies online. And I'm going to be doing some promotion these next few days this week regarding my Patreon site. So I've been doing Patreon since January, I think is when I started my Patreon site. So almost 9 months ago. And I'm going to begin to highlight some of the archive content that we have on there, right? We've had Q&As with some fascinating people. We had Q&As with Jamar Tisby. We had Q&As with Rachel McNair. We had Q&As with people like Renee Begay and so many other people. So I'm going to begin highlighting some of that. There's 9 lectures on there that I've given over the past year about Christian nationalism and the trauma of white America and things like that. And I'm going to begin highlighting some of that. We also have 8 chapters, or not 7 chapters of Unselling Truths that Siouxsan and I have been doing a book study on. And so I want to highlight for people that when they subscribe to my Patreon, not only do they get access to new content we create this month, but they also get access to all of this archive content that is on there at the different tier levels. And so I'm going to begin promoting that again. And I'm also going to let people know that my Unselling Truths book tour is not over. I'm still planning events for this tour, and I'm looking for a way to incorporate it into my more common speaking schedule. And so I did that last week by going to Philadelphia. Next week, I'm going to Charlottesville. I'm planning a trip to Portland, Oregon, and I'm hoping to extend that trip by a few days to set up both a book event in a book tour event in Portland, Oregon, as well as in Seattle, Washington. I'm hoping to plan another event in Atlanta, Georgia, and a few other places. And so if you are interested in continuing to help me get the word out about this book and help elevate this conversation around the doctrine of discovery, I would really appreciate it. The only reason I've been able to do this tour is because so many people have been willing to partner with me and help cover some of the expenses of these tours. And so I'm continuing to raise funds for that. I set a budget at the beginning of this tour of about $15,000, and we've raised about half of that. We've been able to cover all of the expenses that came out of my cross-country trip and all the events we did for the past 7 weeks. And now I'm looking forward to a kind of a new schedule, more spread out over the next several months as I continue to try to engage people around the doctrine of discovery and unsettling truth. And so I'm deeply grateful for everyone who's partnered with me up to this point, and I want to invite people, if you would like to help me get this message out even further, the experience I've had of being able to initiate dialogues by traveling to cities and not waiting for an invitation, but going in and setting up events in different cities has been phenomenal. And it's allowed me to reach so many people, hundreds of people I would have never reached had I just waited for an invitation. And so I am hoping to be able to continue to do things like this as I move forward. And I very much welcome your partnership in that. So anyway, I hope all of you are having a really good day. I hope that your second cup of coffee is as good as mine is. And I'm looking forward. I'll let you know, but I'm hoping I'll have Siouxsan Robinson on my second cup of coffee later this week, and we'll talk about her perspective that I shared a little bit from her Facebook post, as well as the work that she's doing and the organization is doing to work in Native communities around throughout all of Turtle Island, both in the U.S. and in Canada. So, my relatives, walk in beauty, and may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Hakone.